He drove until the stars came out, then drove some more. The stolen transport groaned beneath him, a heavy-grade hauler built for the Kreth labor, camps, not for open road, and it showed in every shudder of the chassis. Every complaint from the magnetic suspension as he pushed it past its rated speed. Devon kept both hands on the control yoke. His knuckles were pale. He'd stopped noticing that an hour ago. Behind him, somewhere on the dark plain, the Kreth compound was burning. He could feel it more than see it. A warmth on the back of his neck. He did not look in the mirror. The hauler's nav system had been wiped clean, because of course it had. The Kreth didn't let their labor assets navigate anywhere. The landscape ahead was empty and dark. The moons of this continent low and orange near the horizon. He knew one direction, away. That was enough for now. That had to be enough. His hands were shaking. He pressed them harder against the yoke. 16 months. That was how long the Kreth had held him. He'd counted in scratch marks on the inside of his wrist cuff, a private calendar that the Kreth never noticed because the Kreth didn't understand the human habit of keeping time on your own body. They understood labor output. They understood behavioral compliance. The concept of a person scratching marks into their own skin to remember what day it was. That wasn't in their calculus. Davin remembered the night they'd taken him, a survey mission gone sideways, a malfunction, a crash, and then the Kreth scouting party arriving before the rescue beacon had finished its first cycle. They'd been polite about it. In their way, Kreth were always polite. It was one of their more disturbing qualities. The supervisor who'd processed him, a Kreth designated in the camp records as Vossel 7, had done so with the patient unhurried manner of someone filing insurance paperwork. It checked his vitals. It logged his name and colony of origin. It explained, in near-perfect consortium standard, that his labor output would be evaluated over a probationary period, and that sustained compliance would be rewarded with improved caloric allocation. Then it had put him in the cage. Devan kept driving. He found the first outpost by accident, which was the only way he could have found it. There was no marker, no signal, no visible structure. Just a half-collapsed formation of rock near a dry riverbed, and inside it, a cramped den that smelled of recycled air and unwashed humans, and two men sitting on opposite sides of a small heater looking at him like they'd never expected to see a face they recognized again. Corvin and Blaze. He'd known them before, loosely. They ran supply lines for independent settlers on the Outer Rim, which was a generous description of what they actually did, but it had put them in the same orbital stations as Davin often enough that he knew their faces. He'd never imagined he'd cry at the sight of either of them. He didn't cry. He was too tired to cry. Something in his chest did a thing he couldn't name, and he sat down on the floor of their outpost without being invited, and Corvin handed him a heat pack without a word, and Blaze pulled off his own knit cap and pushed it into Devan's hands because Devan was shaking, and the cap was warm. "You look like something the Kreth dragged in," Blaze said. "Yeah," Davin said. "You want to tell us?" "Later." Press the cap against his face. Breathe through it. Later. They didn't push him. That was the thing about people who'd spent time in the outer territories. They understood when later meant something specific. They gave him water. They gave him what passed for food out here. They let him sleep on the floor for 4 hours, and when he woke up, they were both still there, keeping watch, and neither of them had gone anywhere or told anyone, and Davin understood that they were doing this. The water, the silence. The staying, because they were the kind of people who did things like this quietly, without calculation. "I need to get to a resettlement broker," he said when he could talk properly. Corvin and Blaze exchanged a look. "That's not a short list of problems," Corvin said. "No. Kreth are going to post a recovery notice. I know. Your biometrics are in their system. I know." Blaze leaned forward, with his elbows on his knees. "The only broker who can cut a new ident and arrange passage without going through consortium channels is a man called Marsh. He operates out of a mid-tier transit hub about 400 kilometers north of here. He charges." He looked at Devan steadily. "He charges a lot." Devan thought about the camp, about the labor records. About 16 months of scratch marks on the inside of his wrist. How much? Blaze told him. Davin said nothing for a long moment. Then, I know where there's money. Vossel 7 had kept a private residence in the settlement district adjacent to the camp. This was unusual for a Kreth. Most of the supervisor caste lived within the compound's administrative levels, but Vossel 7 had what the Kreth, in their precise taxonomy of preference, called an acquisitive orientation. It collected things, human things, mostly. Objects it found interesting for reasons that were never entirely clear. Darwin knew about the residence because Vossel 7 had, on 3 separate occasions, brought him along to perform maintenance tasks there, always with a small security escort, always with the placid conversational cheer of someone who did not understand why the person it was speaking to might not enjoy the conversation. He understood now why it had taken him specifically. He was the only one in the camp who had worked structural engineering. Vossel 7 had needed someone who could identify the load-bearing elements in its walls. Because there was a hidden compartment in the floor of the second room sealed behind a false substrate panel that required engineering knowledge to open without destroying it, and inside that compartment was a considerable quantity of off-ledger credit chips that Vossel 7 had apparently been accumulating through means that would not have survived Kreth administrative review. Vossel 7 had shown him where it was. It had, Davin reflected, made a significant miscalculation. The settlement district was quiet at the hour he reached it, the streets narrow and dim, lit by the amber-orange glow of Kreth commercial signage. There were humans here, settlement workers, traders, people who lived at the intersection of necessity and accommodation that the Kreth called cooperative integration. But they moved with the particular quality of people who had learned to take up minimal space. Darwin moved the same way. 16 months had taught him that much, at least. He found the residence. The lock read his biometrics and then sat there for a moment, confused, because his biometrics were registered in Vossel 7's residential access log as belonging to a maintenance worker who was supposed to be inside a labor compound several kilometers away. The lock eventually decided that this was not its problem and let him in. The second room. False substrate panel. He worked by feel in the dark, his fingers remembering the sequence of pressure points that would release the locking mechanism without triggering the substrate alarm. Vossel 7 had not changed the sequence. Davin wasn't sure if that was arrogance or oversight, or simply that the Kreth didn't fully understand human memory the way they didn't fully understand scratch marks on wrist cuffs. He had the panel open in under 3 minutes. The compartment held the credit chips, and beneath them, data chip that he didn't recognize. He pocketed both without examining them. Then the outer door of the residence opened, and 2 Krayeth enforcement officers walked in. He was under the floor panel before they'd crossed the threshold, pulling the substrate closed over his head in a motion that was almost calm. Almost. His heart was a fist slamming against his sternum. He controlled his breathing with the disciplined, mechanical focus of someone who'd spent 16 months learning to control everything mechanical, and disciplined because the alternative was worse. The officers moved through the residence with the brisk efficiency of a security sweep. They were looking for something. Whatever it wasn't a substrate panel that was indistinguishable from the surrounding floor. They ran through their protocol and left, and Darwin lay in the dark under Vossel 7's floor for 4 more minutes before he came out. Because 4 minutes was the standard Kreth recheck interval, and he had learned the standard Kreth recheck interval the way you learn everything, in captivity, by paying attention because your life depended on it. The officers hadn't been Kreth enforcement. He realized this 2 hours later, when the cold and the dark and the adrenaline had settled enough for him to process what he'd seen. The uniform pattern had been slightly wrong. The equipment loadout had been non-standard. He'd registered both things and filed them away during the sweep, and now, driving north in the dark, he extracted them from his memory and looked at them carefully. Not Kreth enforcement. which meant they were looking for the credit chips, or the data chip, on behalf of someone else. Someone who knew about Vossel 7's private compartment. The data chip suddenly felt heavier in his pocket. Marsh operated out of a transit way station that called itself a hospitality and logistics center, which was accurate in the same way that saying a razor was a personal grooming implement was accurate. The way station was a maze of levels and corridors and small rooms where transactions occurred that left no formal record. Marsh himself occupied a suite near the top that was surprisingly comfortable, which told Davin something about the man's margins. He was broad, Marsh, and unhurried in the way that people who've never had to hurry become unhurried. He sat across from Davin with his hands folded on the table and his eyes doing the actual work. New biometrics, Davin said. New registered identity. Passage to the outer colonies out of Kreth-administered space. Corvin and Blaze say you can do that. I can. It's the number, Marsh told him. Davin put the credit chips on the table. Marsh looked at them. He looked at Davin. These are Kreth system chips. Yes. Off-ledger. Yes. There'll be an inquiry. There's already an inquiry, Davin said. There's always already an inquiry. The question is whether the inquiry can find me before you can finish what I'm paying you to do. A long pause. Marsh picked up one of the chips and turned it over between his fingers with the contemplative ease of a man who had made many decisions like this, and had developed a comfortable relationship with the process. There's something else, Davin said. He put the data chip on the table. Marsh looked at it without touching it. What is that? I don't know. I found it in the same place as the credits. Someone came looking for it before I got clear. Not Kreth enforcement, private contractors. Which means someone already knows it's gone and they'll be working backward to figure out who has it. Which is now me, Marsh said. Which is now you. Davin met his eyes. I'm telling you because you need to know, not because I'm asking you to handle it. What's on the chip means what you do about it. That's your business. I just need to not be here when whoever is looking for it arrives. Marsh put the data chip down. He looked at it for another long moment. Then he looked at Davin with the expression of a man recalibrating an estimate. 2 days, he said. I can have everything ready in 2 days. The data chip was a problem that found him anyway. He'd taken a room in the lower levels of the way station, the kind of room that asked no questions and expected no answers, and he was sitting in it on the second evening when the door opened, and 2 men walked in who were not Kreth and were not way station staff and were wearing the same subtly wrong uniform pattern he'd seen in Vossel 7's residence. One of them was big, the other was bigger. They both had the unhurried manner of people who had made a calculation and found it favorable. The chip, Big One said, we know you have it. We know you've passed it to Marsh. We want both. You walk away. And if I say the chip is Marsh's problem now, then Marsh's problem becomes very specific, and so does yours. Davin looked at them. He looked at the room, the door, the spacing, the furniture. 16 months in a Kreth Fleabacamp had, among other things, given him a very clear understanding of enclosed spaces. All right, he said. He stood up slowly, reaching for his coat with the deliberate, unthreatening movements of someone complying. He took the coat from the hook, he put it on, and from the interior pocket of the coat, not the right pocket, where they were looking because that was where he'd placed his hand when he'd taken the coat from the hook. He drew the compact tool blade he'd been carrying since the 3rd night in the camp, when the camp's tool supervisor had decided that a maintenance worker could not be trusted with his own implements between shifts, and Davin had decided the camp's tool supervisor was wrong. It was a short, controlled engagement. Not clean. Nothing like this was clean, but definite. Afterward, he stood in the middle of the room, breathing carefully, the way he'd practiced breathing in the cage when he needed to stay functional, and he thought about Vossel 7's patients, and about scratch marks on wrist cuffs, and about the fact that he was still here, still standing, still choosing. He left the room. He found the other 2 associates in the way station's lower commercial level. There were always 2 more. In these situations, he'd learned that. and he did not let them have the first move. He was done letting things happen to him. He had been done with that for some time. Afterward, he burned what needed to be burned. He was methodical about it. Marsh had the documents ready the next morning. He slid the ident chip across the table without comment. He did not ask about the previous night. He was, in that way, a professional. Haines Station, Marsh said. Outer colonies, Arlan Reach. Ship leaves in 3 hours. Your name, as far as the transit register is concerned, is Ellen Cove. You're a civil survey technician relocating after a contract completion. Civil survey technician, Davin said. It suits your biometric cover. You've got the hands for it. A pause, and the eyes. Davin looked at the ident chip. His face on it, but a different name, a different history. Someone who had never been in a Kreth labor camp. Someone who had never been assigned a number instead of a name, who had never learned to count months in scratches, who had never lain under a false floor panel with their hearts slamming and their breathing controlled and controlled and controlled. He thought about what Corvin had said when Davin had told him he was going north alone to deal with the Marsh situation himself. You don't have to do it by yourself. He thought about Blaze pushing the knit cap into his hands without explanation. He thought about Jane. Jane had been in the camp for 2 months when he arrived, and she'd been dead for 11 months when he left. A respiratory complication from the camp's air recyclers, which the Kreth maintained to Kreth respiratory tolerances and not to human ones, and which they adjusted only when the labour output data indicated a system-wide problem, was not the same as indicating that any individual human was dying, which was a distinction the Kreth were very precise about. He'd known her in the way you know people you share a cage with. Not well, but enough. She'd had a way of looking at the camp's perimeter as though she was studying, which she was, with the patient, unfoolable attention of someone who had decided that the situation was temporary, and had meant every word of that decision. She'd told him once, sitting on the floor of the maintenance bay with her eyes on the ceiling, the universe doesn't run on waiting. You make a choice, or someone makes it for you. The choice doesn't care if you're scared. He'd filed it away. He'd filed everything away. You became very good at filing things away. In the camp, she hadn't made it to her own escape plan. He'd made it for her. The ship was a mid-grade passenger hauler, nothing remarkable, its hold full of settlement equipment and its passenger manifest full of people who, going somewhere new for reasons they kept to themselves. Darwin found a seat by the port viewport and watched the Kreth-administered world fall way below the hull. He was still wearing Blaze's knit cap. He hadn't taken it off since Blaze had put it in his hands. It was warm, and it was the kind of warmth that came from outside of you, which was different from the kind you generated yourself, and he was not ready to give that up yet. He'd left a message for Corvin and Blaze with Marsh before he'd boarded. Not contact information, nothing traceable, just words. Something like, I got clear. You were the first good thing in 16 months. He hadn't said thank you, because the thing they'd done for him was past thank you. He'd said something else instead. He'd said, you're the smartest people I know. Meant it. Haines Station. He'd heard about it from the man who'd become his closest point of reference in the camp during the last 3 months, a former transit operator named Kell who'd survived longer than anyone expected and who'd had, in the way that people who have survived things sometimes have, an encyclopedic knowledge of places far away from where they were. If I was younger, Kell had, during one of the nights when the lights were low and the shift supervisors were cycling and you could talk softly, I'd go to the Arlan Reach, Haines Station, good soil on the orbital settlements, good people, mostly, the kind of place where no one's in a hurry to know your history. Kell had not made it out of the camp. Darwin was going to Haines Station. From the viewport, the stars were steady, not moving. He knew they were moving. Everything was moving. The ship and the stars and the slow machine of the galaxy. But from where he sat, they looked steady, fixed, like they'd been nailed there. He remembered lying on the floor of the maintenance bay and staring up through the camp's recycled air and thinking, those are still there. Ever else, those are still there. The ident chip was in his jacket pocket. Ellen Cove, civil survey technician. Turned the name over in his mind without resentment. A name was a thing you built into, not a thing you were handed. He had 6 weeks of transit time to start building. He took out the small notebook he'd bought in the way station's commercial level. Actual paper, which was expensive, but which he'd bought anyway, because there was something about paper that he needed right now. The specific reality of it, the fact that you couldn't wipe it clean without destroying it. He opened it to the first page. He wrote, "I am not a number." He looked at it for a while, then he wrote, "I know how to run. I know how to stay still. I know how to breathe through the hard parts. I know how to keep counting when there's nothing to count with but your own skin. I know what it costs and I paid it." He stopped. He thought about Jane, who had looked at the perimeter with patient, unfoolable attention and decided the situation was temporary. He thought about Kel, who had dreamed out loud about good soil and good people. He thought about Vossel 7, had believed that the person it was speaking to did not constitute a threat because the person it was speaking to was compliant and had been compliant for 16 months and therefore was a person who was compliant. He thought about how that was the thing about humans that the Kreth fundamentally could not map. Gap between how a human behaved and what a human was deciding in the quiet dark inside them to eventually do. The Kreth were very intelligent, precise and patient and organized. They ran their camps with a kind of terrible efficiency, and they had been running them for longer than any human colony had been spacefaring, and they had done so because every species they'd ever encountered had eventually reached the same conclusion: cooperate, comply, accommodate. Eventually, the math said compliance was the rational strategy. The Kreth had not encountered humans in any significant number until recently, and they were still, Devan thought, working out that the math was different. That the thing humans did in the quiet dark was not calculate the rational strategy. The thing humans did was wait and count scratch marks and remember every detail of every room they were kept in, and maintain, under all the compliance and all the accommodation, private tally that had nothing to do with Kreth administrative records. A Taltit said, one day. He slept better than he'd slept in 16 months. He didn't know what to do with that, so he just let it be. When he woke, the stars were in different positions relative to the viewport, because the ship had moved and the stars were fixed and everything was always moving, in relation to everything else. He lay there for a few minutes and breathed and did not make himself count anything. Blazer's cap was on his knee. He must have taken it off in his sleep. He put it back on. There was a Kreth aboard the ship. He saw it in the area during the meal cycle, a traveller by the markings, not administrative caste, the kind of individual Kreth who moved through the outer territories on commercial business. It was sitting alone, eating something suited to Kreth metabolism, doing the thing Kreth did, which was performing a very convincing imitation of being absorbed in its own affairs. Darwin looked at it for a long moment. The Kreth did not look back at him. Why would it? He was Ellen Cove, civil survey technician, unremarkable in every measurable way. He thought about 16 months. He thought about Kel and Jane and Corvin and Blaze and Vossel 7's false floor. He thought about scratch marks. And then he thought about something Jane had said, about the universe not running on waiting, about making a choice. He picked up his meal. He walked to an empty table on the far side of the common area because he was not going to eat near a Kreth today. And that was also a choice, small and private, made without violence, made without anyone knowing he'd made it. The universe didn't record small choices, it just accumulated them. He sat down, he ate, he looked out at the stars. Haynes Station came into view 4 weeks later, earlier than scheduled because the transit corridor had been cleaner than projected. It was smaller than he'd imagined. He'd built it up over months of dreaming about it, which was a thing that happened. But it was real, and it was there, and he could see the green-grey of orbital farm panels along its upper ring, and the amber navigation lights of its docking array, and the slow traffic of ships coming and going without any particular drama. People going somewhere. He pressed his palm against the viewport. The station's beacon was transmitting on the standard arrival frequencies. Registration queries, berthing assignments, ordinary bureaucratic metabolism of a working port. He listened to it without anxiety. He had papers, he had a name. He had 6 weeks of practice being Ellen Cove, and he was surprisingly good at it because, it turned out, Ellen Cove was just a person trying to get somewhere, and Davin understood that from the inside. The shuttle to the station was small and crowded and smelled of recycled air, which hit him wrong for a moment, and then he breathed through it, and it was fine. The intake officer at the station's registration desk was human, middle-aged, with the efficient distraction of someone who had processed several hundred arrivals this cycle and expected to process several hundred more. She took his ident chip, ran it, handed it back. "Civil survey," she said. "Yes, we've got 3 operations running in the Reach currently, if you're looking for contract work." She was already moving to the next field in her terminal. "Housing registries on level 4. Welcome to Haynes." "Thank you," Davin said. She had already looked away. He stepped through the processing gate and into the station's main concourse, and the noise hit him. Voices, footsteps, the ambient hum of a working population going about its business. And for a moment he just stood in the middle of it and let it be loud, let it be people, let it be the specific weight of other humans being alive near him, without any context of what do or not do. His throat tightened. He breathed. He was going to be a carpenter. He didn't know why that was the thing that had surfaced. He had no formal training, and the practical skills he'd built in the camp were in structural assessment and maintenance, not finish work. But he'd been thinking about it since the way station, and it felt right in the way that things feel right when you're done. Calculating and starting to choose, working with his hands, building things that were meant to stay. He found a bench near the concourse's central fountain, actual water, cycling through a closed system. It was an extravagance that someone had decided was worth it, and he sat down. He took the notebook from his jacket. He opened to where he'd stopped weeks ago in the transit ship, and he continued writing. He wrote about Kel. He wrote about Jane. He wrote about Corvin handing him a heat pack without a word, and Blaze taking off his own hat, and the scratch marks he'd kept on his wrist, and the floor panel in Vossel 7's residence, and the stars from the viewport, and the specific sound of the Haynes station beacon transmitting on standard approach frequencies, like everything was ordinary. Like arrival was ordinary, like being here was something that just happened. He wrote, "I made it." He looked at that for a while. He could feel the hum of the station around him, the living hum, the breathing hum, the hum of something that went on regardless. He thought about Vossel 7's calm administrative certainty, its patient taxonomy of human behavior, its fundamental conviction that the variable it had catalogued as Davan 4 was a known and bounded quantity. He almost smiled. Kreth were very precise. They were very thorough, but they had made, across their long administration of other people's labour, a single consistent error. They looked at what a human was doing and decided that was the same as what a human was. He capped the pen. He put the notebook back in his jacket, next to the ident chip, next to the space where the data chip had been. He sat for another minute in the noise and the light and the water sound. Then Davan, Ellen Cove, got up, adjusted Blaze's cap on his head, and walked deeper into the station to find out what a person could build, starting from here.